Welcome to my YouTube. I am Madison and this is Planet with Madison, and this is where I will show you how to avoid the three killers of wealth, which are taxes, market loss, and inflation. If you are a business owner, a W-2 with a side hustle, or a 1099, you have come to the right place, because this is where I teach you how to keep more of what you make, protect yourself against a tumultuous market, and how to hedge against the depreciation of the dollar. Now let's get into it. I started in the financial industry about... The title of this first YouTube was something that I decided to base everything off of, because for me, I believe that this is the foundation of why our system is the way it is and how you can actually see clearly past what is going on and why it's happening the way it's happening. Maybe it'll feel a little conspiracy theory to you, maybe not, but this is the history and I'm just gonna lay it out for you and then you can decide for yourself. That's what I believe is how you should teach, how you should inform people, and how you should make decisions. Is I'm gonna give you the information and then you can decide for yourself whether or not it fits or resonates and it feels true to you, and then go research it yourself, right? I'm not gonna spoon feed you. I don't work with people who I have to spoon feed anyways, so if I'm already having to spoon feed you, this isn't gonna work. But let me get into why I titled it what I did and why this is the foundation for all of my other YouTube videos going forward. I titled this video how the modern underdog, which is you, me, and most of us within the system, can use a pre-Federal Reserve strategy in order to create financial sovereignty. So hence what I just said, you can see how I'm laying out the foundation for you, and then you can decide for yourself what direction you want to go with that. Now, first and foremost, I want to go into the history of our financial system and where it really started. And it wasn't back in 1776, where we signed the Declaration of Independence and we want to get away from Great Britain. Sure, it kind of started there, but our modern financial system really started in the 1900s. So in December 1913, what happened was the Federal Reserve was created, right? Before that, we didn't have a Federal Reserve. Everything was a little bit more like locally based, and there were banks, and individual banks were in charge of their own system. What really happened was, where there were a lot of scares, there was a lot of up and downs. Banks were lending out way too many loans that they had not really stable collateral against, and they had a lot of fluctuations. They didn't usually have the reserves or the capital to be able to give people their money back. So then what happened is in November of 1910, a group of the most powerful bankers in the United States at the time had a secret meeting on an island called Jekyll Island. And what they did is they met together and they crafted this central banking system. And of course, there were a lot of opposers, so it became very political, right? So there were a lot of people who opposed the central banking system, basically saying that the government was going to be in charge of our money and they're going to have too much of their hands in what we're doing with our finances, right? Anyways, so in 1910, the group of bankers got together on Jekyll Island, and then 2 years later in 1912, the Titanic, okay? And so people talk about the Titanic and how it was like this big hoax or the scam, and this is why, okay? The Titanic was owned by JP Morgan. JP Morgan was like one of the main instigators behind the central bank. The reason why he was like the number one dude is because he had to bail out the United States banking system, the banks and the United States, from all of these banking scares. He had to foot his own funds and say, I'm gonna take care of you guys because you guys can't do it yourselves. Well, we don't like that, right? Because you're basically saying like, you can't do it yourselves and you're irresponsible, so let me be the big brother and I'm gonna take care of you. Sounds like our modern United States government today, right? Anyways, JP Morgan had to essentially come in and save people, and he decided that there needs to be a system because people can't do it themselves. And we love that. So then the Titanic set sail, and this was owned by JP Morgan. He was supposed to be on the Titanic as well, canceled his ticket last minute, and a lot of the opposers to the central banking system were on the Titanic. So again, read between the lines, take it with a grain of salt, take it for what you will, but this is what happened. Okay, so then at the end of that year, by 1913, the Federal Act Reserve was passed. But let's fast forward now to the 1920s and the Great Depression, right? So we've had banking scares leading up to the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and then we have the Great Depression. And what led to the Great Depression? We have a few things, and it's led to believe that, one, there were tariffs, okay? So high tariffs, kind of like we're experiencing now, but on top of the tariffs is that typically with a tariff, it's gonna bring in local economic exchange. So you have, higher tariffs, so people are gonna try buying things from local farmers, right? So it could essentially boost the internal economy. However, there was the Dust Bowl. Dust Bowl wipes out all of the crops with the central US, and all of a sudden farmers aren't able to actually produce, and to support the tariffs, So then that obviously leads to a lack of being able to have food and access to internal supply of certain things. So then you also have the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve was very new, and that is what led to the Great Depression. What got us out of the Great Depression, some say that it was World War II. And again, we can go into why World War II was even fought, and again, more conspiracies behind that, but I'm not actually gonna go into that because that's not my point here, is to be a conspiracy theorist. I think there's plenty of other channels about that, but what I'm going into is like, what got us to the position we're in today within our system. So you had the Great Depression. You can start to kind of see patterns in our modern society as to like what's going on and what may occur as things continue. The missing piece though is that the Federal Reserve failed at the one job that it was created for. And instead of providing elasticity and being able to actually have like an exchange of capital the way it was supposed to with a reserve, it actually allowed the money supply to collapse. The attempt to create stability actually created instability. So now let's talk about why the instigation of the Federal Reserve at the time actually led to where we're at now. So Young Ong, she is an economist. It was on an episode of Freakonomics podcast where she explained that in a democracy with free markets, the access to capital acts like financial steroids. So what's actually happened is that there's been a huge amount of access capital, and that's what she talks about, is access capital. And with the Federal Reserve and the banking system and the way it's set up, there is a huge supply of access capital. You can go to the bank, get a loan, whatever you want, and then you see a lot of this with real estate, and I'm not a huge fan of real estate right now. So anyways, that being said, you see a lot of like real estate agents and like real estate tycoons. They go in, they just leverage and leverage and leverage and leverage, and debt is wealth now, and that's what they do, right? And so the economy though, what happens is that it has essentially grown without having the muscle to back it. So again, like financial steroids. But that being said, Naval Ravikant, he said that I would actually rather be a poor person in a rich country than a rich person in a poor country, or he actually said a rich person back in like aristocratic France, because even being a poor person, and I lived in the Philippines for over a year, even being a poor person in a rich country is still better than being a rich person in a poor country. So keep that in mind. I'm not sitting here saying like, you know, America sucks, because I actually love America. And even Young Ong said, she's like, it's first world problems, right? Like you living in America and having the opportunities that you do and the access to the things that you have access to isn't normal, right? So we still live in a very privileged country, and I don't want to displace that because of what I'm talking about. I'm focusing on the problems so that I can provide a solution, right? But I'm not gonna focus on the problems and completely discount the fact that America is actually still great. And I actually am very much pro-capitalism in a lot of ways, but the way that capitalism has developed in our society, and it is, Young Ong said, it is because of democracy that corporations have gained power essentially over the government because of the free market. And free market also entails survival of the fittest. So if you don't join, you die. And that's what happens, is that if you don't compete, then you fall to the bottom of the totem pole. So it is very much based on competition, freedom of choice, freedom, free markets, freedom to build, but at the expense of maybe your nervous system. I talk about that too, but you know, corporate dominance, consumer traps, fake financial freedom, again, building the economy on steroids. In China, this is an example of the economy on steroids. There has been an investment, a front-loading investment into real estate that actually hasn't been purchased, and that's completely empty. They call it the ghost cities in China. And these were built with the intent of rallying up people from the countryside and putting them into these homes or these apartments or complexes, whatever they've built, closer to the city, right? So they're trying to bring people in, rally people in, make them controllable, if you will. But what this did is this pre-inflated China's economy, and it's not actually real or tangible. So this is where I've talked about a little bit on my page too, where when we went away from gold, and FDR is actually the one that rallied up everybody's gold and said, you have to turn your gold into the government in exchange for paper dollars. And that was a huge, huge problem, because dollars can be manipulated, and digital currency is going to be even more manipulatable than paper dollars. But gold is tangible, and it keeps people honest. So the problem is with this pre-inflation or these financial steroids is that they are ballooning the economy without actually having any backing. So if anything happens, guess what? that all goes to shit. There's no actual tangible value. And so the loss is so much greater because we're living off of this false stimulation or inflation of the value of our currency. Now let's talk about who survived the Great Depression financially. So pre-Federal Reserve, okay, I've talked about this a little bit. I've actually mentioned life insurance. I'm actually not going to talk as much about life insurance, but with JP Morgan, he's actually one of the primary investors into life insurance prior to the Federal Reserve. Why life insurance? Life insurance isn't technically considered an investment, right? Legally. It is considered, however, an asset. It is a place where you can store cash, and it's with a company as opposed to the Federal Reserve or the government, okay? So you're putting money into something that is tangibly backed by assets because the companies have to be able to have money or reserves enough to be able to pay a death benefit. If they can't pay a death benefit, they're not a life insurance company, right? So they actually are gonna have more reserves a lot of time than even the Federal Reserve. So that being said, JCPenney, Disney, Walt Disney, Stanford University, even JP Morgan himself, they all put money into life insurance and were able to take funds out and use them during the Great Depression. So if you think about that, life insurance and companies like, life insurance companies, financial institutions that are a little bit more privatized, they survive things like recessions and depressions because of how they manage their capital. Okay, so I actually went to a meeting with the company that I'm with, one of my third parties, this last summer, and they were talking about how they actually have a 10-to-1 capital to asset ratio, right? So they actually keep more capital on hand as a reserve than most companies do to be able to pay out what they need to pay out. They have a lot more stability for this reason, and some would say they would actually be leaving money on the table because if you don't have a 6-to-1 capital to asset ratio, technically you're leaving money on the table. So that can apply to personal finances as well. Where if you have more capital, on hand or cash on hand, you're losing money to inflation, right? You're losing money to, maybe what you could get in an asset. So you're losing compound interest, but you have reserve, right? For the people that you're supposed to help. So if you kind of think about like what I've been talking about up to this point, is that the lack of tangible reserves is really what screws people over. And again, this can apply to personal finance as well, where if you don't have a good tangible amount of personal finance, you have to sell off your assets and you can get to a really sticky position, your own personal recession or depression. So the reason I would opt for using these type of financial institutions as opposed to the Federal Reserve system or even like the stock market for protecting myself against the system is because they operate on true market value as opposed to speculative value. Okay, so what's the pre-Federal Reserve strategy that I am referring to? So I've talked about, what survived the Great Depression, financial institutions, the difference between true market value and false value, the Federal Reserve establishment and how people are using this the system that we've been told that is the only system to use financially. But what I'm referring to is back in 1890, American Express was the first company to set up a private pension. 1890 came before the Federal Reserve in 1913, okay? Pre-Federal Reserve, right? Think about, so is American Express still around today? Yes. Is it one of the largest institutions in the United States? Yes, it is. It's the American Express, NFL, IBC just implemented their own pension. And the reason I believe for this is because of the stability, 1. 2, everything you put into a pension is completely tax deductible. Meaning that what you're doing with a pension is you're taking funds, you're able to deduct everything you put into it, you stick it in this fund that's, has a relative degree of growth, but it's protected, it's outside of the main system, the main institution. And it's guaranteed by a separate entity as opposed to the Federal Reserve or FDIC. It's guaranteed by the PBGC and these life insurance companies. And that's why we're actually required by law, according to the IRS tax code, to use life insurance companies for this reason, because you need a guarantee. So if you want a guarantee on your money and the value of your money, you're going to use something that's pre-Federal Reserve, that's not stemmed down on speculative value. This is what I do to provide you financial sovereignty, okay? So we're taking money and instead of sticking it into the bank where you're gonna actually be losing value and who knows if it's actually guaranteed at that point. You're actually gonna be able to take your cash out. I know if you ever put like a big lump sum into the bank, you ever try to go get it out and they don't actually have those funds, it's gonna take quite a while to actually get those funds out because they don't have the reserves. Remember, we talked about this. Whereas if you go with another company that actually has the reserves on hand because they have a higher capital to asset ratio, you're gonna be able to access it sooner. Not just that though, but it is protected against market fluctuations. It's tax deductible. So here's what I do here though. And this is why I mentioned business owners, because in 2006, there was an act called the Pension Protection Act of 2006. And this allowed for not just large corporations like Amex and IBC. And sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, oh, it's only allowed for, large corporations. Actually, not true. And this is where we can really take advantage of this in our modern era. And this is why I believe actually that the timing of the 2006 Pension Protection Act was so vital for our 2026, 20 years later, 2026 era. Because as a business owner, because of this act, you are actually able to put up to 75% of your gross income. So you can do what the corporations have done and protect yourself against the fluctuating system, right? So you can take this money, you can put it into a pension, it's protected, it's guaranteed, and a pre-Federal Reserve stability. You have early retirement access. You're not waiting until you're 59 and a half. You can access it after 5 years, and business owners can do this. So not only are you avoiding taxes, you're avoiding market volatility, and you're hedging against the fluctuation of the dollar going forward. So this is why I say I help who I help, how I help them, and what I do to establish sovereignty, financial sovereignty, in the face of the fluctuating dollar and the volatility of the system, okay? So again, there are other ways. I'm gonna go into this in another video, and there's other ways where people say that they file exempt, they completely go out of the system, and they go off grid. Okay, that's fine. But this is a way to slowly start to step out of the system while still being able to work within the system, right? For me, I see it as a stepping stone for whatever direction you want to go. Because after 5 years, you can access that capital and you can do something with it. Maybe you are purchasing some form of tangible asset, whether it be, maybe it is gold, maybe it is stocks in companies, or maybe it is real estate, tangible real estate, right? But you're not using the banking system. You're not using the Federal Reserve. You're going around it, and you're using your tax dollars to do it. So this is how I believe that the modern underdog, you and me, can actually get away from having to use the Federal Reserve system that has shown to be very corrupt and not actually do what it says it was supposed to do in the first place. Because somebody like JP Morgan came in and said that the American people can't think for themselves or manage their money themselves. So if you're the type of person where you actually think, wow, I don't want to be taken advantage of, and I want to be able to use my money, they're not tax dollars, it's my money, to be able to work around the Federal Reserve and the system, then this is what I do. And this is how I help people. And I'm gonna go into different ways of working around it. But I wanted to use this video as like a foundation video for everything I talk about going forward, because this is the big why for me. Think about it, if corporations and banks, and I didn't mention that banks actually use life insurance products and pensions as their tier 1 capital, banks, universities, and billionaires all use pre-Federal Reserve hacks, why wouldn't you? They're gonna tell you to use the pre-Federal Reserve and go around it themselves. It sounds a little fishy. So if you want to rebuild the financial freedom that the Federal Reserve has taken from you, reclaim your opportunities and set up your own private pension, then go ahead and click the link below and we can hop on a call. Otherwise, subscribe to my YouTube and let's learn more about this.